Hello class, I'm doing my draft of the paper 1. So my title is The Negative Consequences to Defunding the Police. The term defunding the police is a hard topic to talk about today. There are two sides to the topic, where one side is more of wanting the police to either have less funding, no funding, or there just be flat out no police at all. But the other side is rather to have the police keep their funding and ask that the police training be updated. And the overall opinion that many people are leaning towards, which includes me, is that the police need to change some of their policies regarding arrests. The opinion to get rid of police is completely out of the question. Yeah, and in the article the National Police Support Fund posted, they quote, this one might seem obvious, but it's worth stating explicitly. Lower police budgets mean fewer police officers, keeping our streets and communities safe. But it's not only that. Defunding the police places a greater strain on existing officers and reduces the likelihood that they'll quit or perform their jobs ineffectively because they're burned out. And that's the end of the article. And I think the article makes a great point that if you just put strain on the funding, it'll cause the whole point of the fighting for, like, what's the cause for fighting in these like rioters and such other problems that we've had from protests. And just because of the riots, there has had to be an excess of overtime for the officers working to stop the riots, which is actually counteracting the whole problem that the people wanting the police to have no funding or less funding. And the amount that the officers had to be paid is well beyond what is typical for them. And as the article from the Courier Herald explains, because police are shorthanded, officers are working lots of overtime, including the data obtained by Portland. KATU News. The Portland Police Bureau spent over $6.9 million in overtime from June and July in 2020, which is a 200% increase in overtime spending compared to the same period last year. That's the end of the article. 200% is an unbelievable amount to see, especially after such, only the span of like a month. And this is really over the top, and it's mostly the big problem is because of the riots that were happening in Portland. And it's not going to get any better soon. They're still happening. And like Portland, there are many other states that are still dealing with the protests that started from the last year. And the calls to the action that the police had to go to was some of the most frustrating problems that I had ever seen in my life. And if I were a police officer, I wouldn't want to lay down my life with no support from any officials in either the state or higher government. And the amount of brutal action that the officers has taken to watch, and credit is due to the officers that stay in those streets fighting to protect innocent civilians every day. This article from the Courier Herald is a good explanation about what the problems are with having the police distracted by the riots. London's Daily Mail reported last year more than 60 Portland 911 calls go unanswered overnight as police respond to violent, tumultuous rioting, where protesters threw softball-sized rocks and glass balls at officers. Call types range from theft, vandalism, suspicious activity, hazards, hit and run, burglary, violation of a restraining order, alarms, stolen cars, harassment, and many others. And that's the end of the article. And the innocent people having to deal with the riots are forced to have to deal with it, and the government is too afraid to get involved in the issue at hand, and it's getting really old. And the changes that people want are impossible to achieve because the rioters cannot stop vandalizing, burning down, and stealing from innocent people that are just trying to make a living. So to help us reach that goal that we want someday, we need to stop the riots and progress forward. And we should change how the current system works, but without taking away the budgets of the police. This article from Potomac Local News helps to explain that if we cut back the funding, we will instead see no additional training and instead get a worse outcome. To reduce this type of violence, we should reevaluate policing tactics and make sure our police are trained in the most effective de-escalation skills and techniques possible. If the intense training that police must undergo gets cut back, we will see a sharp rise in bad use of force, decisions, and abuse of power. Good policing requires a commitment to robust training that must be ongoing. This requires funding. And that's the end of the article. And this article states some of the examples that states could use for police training, and this is from the Seattle Times. In Seattle and Washington State, we already are doing what defunding proponents and police abolitionists are calling for within the existing system. Restorative justice, alternatives to incarceration, demilitarizing the police, crisis intervention and de-escalation training community, engagement and holistic collaborative services. Reforms in Seattle and Washington State offer a model that law enforcement agencies in every city and state should implement. And that's the end of the article. And I think that these methods are somewhat excessive, but also could be effective in the long run. But I believe that the police should wear body cams and they should only use the chokehold in more of a life or death situation. Not just when, a simple arrest is made and the guy is already, handcuffed and such. And another problem with having no police being present during the riots was the amount of homeless, deaths, and vandalism being caused by the rioters. And the rioters literally took over a chunk in Seattle, and the number of crimes committed in the section that was taken over was so bad that multiple people were injured and killed. And yet the government did nothing. They stood idly by and said it was peaceful. And I believe that what Martin Luther King stood for, that if he saw what happened today with the current protests, he'd probably be turning in his grave for what he is seeing his dream turn into. And in this article from the City Journal, in the absence of police, one would have to rely on the kindness of strangers. A Minnesota neighborhood has taken up this experiment in the aftermath of George Floyd episode. Powderhorn Park, a Minneapolis neighborhood near where Floyd died, made a collective decision not to call law enforcement into the community. Its residents soon learned that maintaining a community without police is easier said than done. Shortly after residents initiated the new arrangement, the neighborhood park was flooded with hundreds of homeless people setting up a makeshift tent city. The homeless brought with them instead increased traffic, noise, and drug use. That's the end of the article. And this growing crisis is in which the police are being allowed to actually protect every part of their cities is worse than the amount of loitering, vandalism, vagrancy, etc. And it'll just continue to grow further and further into a problem. And as this next article from the Texas Public Policy Foundation explains, bottom line up in front, these are horrible ideas. The defund mantra was originally intended to punish the police, or maybe to abolish them completely. It got off the ground because of the volume of those espousing this incredibly dangerous idea, forcing everyone to respond to this instead of developing real ideas to improve policing. Reimagining policing is an offshoot of this wrong-headed proposition as well. Developing more community services for emotionally disturbed individuals, addicted offenders, and those suffering from mental illness are great ideas, but not at the expense of enforcement capacity. That's the end of the article. And I cannot agree more that the defund statement is not helping to solve the actual issues at hand. And just because you would rather use the money towards helping ill people, it doesn't mean that you'll have to take all of it out of just police funding, or you could even instead just do fundraisers like normal people typically do for raising for like health awareness and other such programs. And as some of the major debates that have been circling around the defunding have been increasing, law enforcement has taken a big blow to its structure and has been brought down to its knees. And it's the greatest downfall I have ever seen happen to the police, and the rioters want to blame all police officers for the mistakes that were committed to unfortunate civilians. But not every officer is a bad man or woman. There are more good cops than there are bad ones. But the rioters only see that one cop that did something wrong and want to blame everyone. And you cannot blame every protester that is outdoing the movement. But a high majority of protesters are committing crimes, and there isn't anyone stopping them. But the police that stayed after the whole city turned on them, they deserve more credit for what they do every day. And even though the crimes committed by certain cops have gone unanswered for many years, do not let the fear of what the communities will do dictate the outcomes of what results in the officers' fates. And the overall problem started with the death of George Floyd, and that is what sparked this revolution in the minority communities, and that is why I always know when there is going to be another riot. You always notice a sudden spike in protests when there was a black civilian killed by an officer, and when media always tries to give a dumb reason towards the reasoning behind the death of the individual. Sometimes it's because the officer was racist, which I find is the weakest argument. In all honesty, a lot of the time the officer makes a split-second decision which causes a panic in their mind. And this is what led to the deaths of so many poor civilians today. And that's the end of my article. Have a good day, everyone.